Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, the history of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically in the year 1976 through the filter of CLEAR, which is catalysts, locations, entities, artifacts, and relationships. And specifically, basically, so I'm going to be talking about this specific year in the history of Dungeons & Dragons through that filter, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. So I got a bit of a mnemonic here for myself, and that mnemonic, is Bloom, Seattle, Alexander, White Earth. All right, so let's jump in. So the catalyst for the year 1976 is a gentleman by the name of Brian Bloom. Brian Bloom was one of the designers on Boot Hill. So Boot Hill is one of the very, very, very early games of TSR, the company that created Dungeons & Dragons. And it is a brand new standalone tabletop role-playing game. And it's really important, right? So Boot Hill was a brand new standalone tabletop role-playing game saying the same rules that we use to create Dungeons & Dragons, that we use to tell stories in this fantasy world, can be used to tell a story in the Wild Wild West, right? And so, and this is really important because it's showing the rest of the field this concept: tabletop role-playing games, cooperative storytelling in a systematized manner, the use of polyhedral dice. All of this can be ported into other worlds. And so this is very, very early on, and people are very excited because they're like, well, if I can see that, you know, if you could do that for the Wild West, we could do that for the Italian Renaissance, you know, or we could do that for a science fiction setting. It's huge. And, you know, early on, this is incredibly exciting, right? So how exciting is that? Well, let's move on to location. Well, it's very exciting that Dungeons & Dragons is starting to spread, and tabletop role-playing games are starting to spread as far as Seattle, Washington. So at this point, the game has reached all the way up to some of the highest points of the West Coast of the United States of America. The game is now 2 years old, and it is literally spreading across the continent of the U.S. It's being played on the East Coast, it's being played on the West Coast, and Seattle, Washington is one of the places where, again, you're seeing this game showing up in coffee shops, in libraries, in universities, at the table, and this is a big one, at the kitchen table. I can't tell you how large a space that had. You know, people played this game at their kitchen table, you know, their dining room table. It was big, right? And it was all across the United States of America, and that happened right away. All right. So that's Seattle, Washington, our location. Let's talk about an entity. This entity is someone who was existent, you know, essentially a non-player character within the history of Dungeons & Dragons. And, you know, not one of the major catalysts, but certainly there, and you'll see how they fit into the history of Dungeons & Dragons right now. So Clifford Alexander Jr. So Clifford Alexander Jr. was the very first African-American Secretary of the United States Army. This was a huge appointment by Gerald Ford, right? And it changed history. It said, you know, minorities are going to be given power within this nation. And Clifford Alexander Jr. was, you know, one of the people who laid the foundation for my vote in 2008 and my vote in 2012 for, you know, as Barack Obama rose to become the first African-American president, right? And that, you know, the success and victory of the entire nation in 2008 and 2012 doesn't happen if you don't see these incremental growth points like Clifford Alexander Jr., right? Now, why am I talking about Clifford Alexander Jr. within the history of Dungeons & Dragons? Well, he was the Secretary of the United States Army. And as we go forward, you will see that the military, the U.S. military, every single branch has a very close relationship with Dungeons & Dragons. So Clifford Alexander Jr. did not do anything to limit people in the Army's ability to play Dungeons & Dragons and allowed the game to spread organically as a hobby within the U.S. Army organically, and did nothing to stop that. Made a conscious decision not to stop people from playing Dungeons and Dragons. If you think that's a small thing, it's not. There were, as you will see soon in the 80s, there were lots of people who were very interested in getting people to stop playing Dungeons and Dragons. Clifford Alexander Jr. said, "I got bigger fish to fry." He was not part of that of those people who were trying to shut Dungeons and Dragons down. He was allowing the troops to engage with the game. And boy, did the troops engage with the game. It is very important to understand that Dungeons and Dragons has always, from the very beginning, from very, very close to the very beginning, was embraced by military troops and has been played all over the world as they serve American military troops as they serve our country. And so, Dungeons and Dragons has a rich history of being played by U.S. military troops. And Clifford Alexander Jr. was right there at the beginning. Right there at the beginning, he could have said, this isn't a hobby we want our people spending time on. There are a lot of regulations on what military troops can and cannot do, and he made a conscious decision not to disallow Dungeons and Dragons, and that is a huge part of the history. Okay. All right, let's talk about the artifact. What was the artifact for 1976? The artifact for 1976 was the 1976 Gary Gygax white box. Okay, so Gary Gygax continued to iterate the game, make it better, and make it more organized and more playable. Now, I had said that the artifact for 1974 was the white box. I was wrong, and I'm going to correct that mistake now. So in 1974, it was the brown box, the Dungeons and Dragons brown box. In 1976, there was the Dungeons and Dragons white box. Now, I'm making that correction now. The artifact for 1974 is the brown box. The artifact for 1976 is the white box. We see another boxed set for Dungeons and Dragons. This is huge. This is really, really important. Okay, and so why is the box set so important? Well, the box sets were incredibly important because it's important to remember. So one, I don't own every single Dungeons and Dragons box set. That would be incredibly difficult to do at this point. Box sets are challenging to collect, and the reason why is they have lots of parts inside of them, and they're made of cardboard, right? Whereas the core rule books, they're very succinct, like they're one piece. They're much easier to collect, they're easier to collect because they're way easier to preserve, right? If you just put a pile of books on top of a box set, you're going to smash it, right? If you open up a box set and use it with your friends, there's a good chance that one of the dice is going to get lost, that the pencil that came with it is going to get lost, that the cardboard chits are going to get lost, that the little rules pamphlet that's in there is going to get lost, right? But box sets are incredibly important to the game of Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason why is, one, we have to realize that's what came first. All right, so the brown box and the white box, the 1974 brown box, 1976 white box were the first out of the gate, right? And they are artifacts of hope. Now, what do I mean by hope? Okay, well, one, without a doubt. Okay, so pretty soon we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about 1E, 2E, 3E, 4E, 5E, right? And of course 6E, which is coming, right? But the reality is, when people think about Dungeons and Dragons today, they think about the PHB, the DMG, and the MMM, and the Monster Manual. In 1976, those did not exist, right? And it's really important to understand that they didn't exist. And the reason why is our idea of Dungeons and Dragons, the world's idea of Dungeons and Dragons, is a big, complex, far-ranging game. And that is what it is. Okay, if you go into Barnes and Nobles today and pick up the PHB, the DMG, and the Monster Manual, you have 700 pages of content to read, right, to play that game. That is immense, and it is complex, right? But we can never, ever forget, it is so important to remember those artifacts of hope. The 1974 brown box, the 1976 white box, Dungeons and Dragons contained in a small 60, 80 page pamphlet, right? Like a rule set, very, very small, not even hardback bound, The whole rule set, very tiny, very succinct, and in reality, much simpler, right? And really, all you're dealing with at this point is you just have the classic core 4, right? You have your rogue, which was called thief then. You have your cleric, you have your wizard, and you have your fighter, right? The scope of the game is incredibly small, right? The rule set is tight. It's tight as a drum, right? And the thing that's wonderful about this, and every single edition of the game has a box set. So if you are a super dope, intelligent, creative, artistic person, you can run with the full game, right? But if you are a person who doesn't have a lot of confidence yet, maybe doesn't have a lot of intelligence, maybe doesn't have a lot of creativity, maybe doesn't have a lot of artistry, right? The box set is there for you, right? To allow you to jump into the game with a incredibly slimmed down version of the rules, that is much more contained and much more manageable, right? It's a more concise, contained game. And I love that about Dungeons & Dragons, that it can be as small as you want it to be or as grand and as large as you want it to be. And that, a simple game is not forgotten. It is not abandoned, right? It's really, really super important to remember that the game started with box sets, right? All right, last, what is the relationship of Dungeons & Dragons for 1976? Well, the relationship for Dungeons & Dragons for 1976 is Dungeons & Dragons' relationship to Middle-earth. Middle-earth is the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, and you cannot talk about Dungeons & Dragons, the first tabletop role-playing game in the world, and it's very incredibly carefully chosen setting. The setting for Dungeons & Dragons is fantasy, and it's not even low fantasy. It's a fantasy game. It has wizards and it has clerics, and they use magic. All of this is spawned from the incredibly important work of J.R.R. Tolkien. And honestly, it is my opinion that to this day, Dungeons & Dragons remains systematized Tolkien. You're looking at J.R.R. Tolkien's work systematized. And so Dungeons & Dragons from 1976 all the way up through to right now, 2019, has had a very close tie and a close relationship with Middle-earth. It is a core fundamental building block of Dungeons & Dragons. That is a J. Scott Garibay clear history of Dungeons & Dragons in the year 1976. Please let me know your thoughts on Dungeons & Dragons in 1976. And please consider liking and subscribing. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.